an ultimate global podcast. Hello, and welcome to our special weekly podcast on trending international and social affairs. You're listening to Saurabh Kora and George Mavros from Sydney.
So welcome again to another exciting series of episodes that we are covering for VCs and angel investors. This is a special series of episodes that we are doing in continuation to the ones that we are doing with the CEOs, founders, and co-founders. So that's more for people who are founding their companies, but also doing from the other side of it and covering on the angel investors and how does an angel investor thinks when they're investing in a company, or what are the things that they look for. So we're joined by Alan Jones from Sydney. He's the angel investor at Aussie Angels, but he's also the director of tech and investment at Third Hemisphere, which is a technology and finance communications firm for innovators and leaders who are breaking new ground and changing the world for better. Most of the times, Alan, we don't waste a lot of time in introducing our guest. And the reason for that is because we want you to tell your own story in your own way to our audience. So why don't you just introduce us and tell us a bit more about what you do at the Third Hemisphere?
Thanks, Sarah. So I started my tech career so long ago that there wasn't a World Wide Web when I began. And because there wasn't a web, and because I was a young tech journalist, the computer magazines that I worked for would send me over to Silicon Valley a lot to attend product launches, interview key executives, go to trade shows and write them up for computer magazines. Because if you're an Australian organization back in the early 1990s and you're adding personal computers to your organization, you needed to know what stuff to buy and how to connect it up and how much memory and how much storage space it should have. And so the only way to do that without the web was computer magazines. We all subscribed to computer magazines. But that repeated exposure to Silicon Valley as a tech journalist made me fall in love with the tech industry itself. And I was no longer content just writing about it. I wanted to be part of it. So the first offer I got was a role at Microsoft, and I worked as a product manager on some of the early products that became part of 9MSN, which was the Australian version of the MSN network. But I was not entirely happy at Microsoft because by that stage, I really wanted to work in a tech startup. And of course, Microsoft was already a huge company. I wanted to work for a little one. So I took the next opportunity that I could and became an early employee of Yahoo. So I was their first product and technical hire in Australia and New Zealand, and I think employee number 118 worldwide. So although I was part of a company of a bit more than 100 people, it was still very much a startup experience. We were given the Yahoo brand and some of the software that used to build Yahoo in the US and told to go forth and build into business in Australia and New Zealand. That went pretty well. And so they gave us the rest of APAC to do as well. But after 5 years with Yahoo, I was the product director for Asia Pacific, and kind of, Yahoo was now a slower, dumber, bigger company than the one that I had joined. So I left to go and do startup ideas of my own. Some of those were moderately successful. A few of them raised venture capital for. But when I hit my 40s, I started to think, well, being a startup founder is all well and good, but I can only do one startup at a time, and not all my ideas are great. I might just run out of time. So I thought, how can I deploy my skills and my experience in more than one startup at once? So that's when I started to look at becoming an angel investor. So I started making my first angel investments in tech around about 2008, 2010. But always along the way, this common thread of storytelling, whether it's in written form, in blog posts, or helping the startups that I mentor and coach with the stories that they tell, whether it's their content or whether it's their pitch to investors or to customers, going out on sales calls with people, helping them with their marketing challenges. So last year, I stepped in as interim CEO of Fishburners, Australia's biggest tech startup community, for a 6-month period to help them out in a sticky period. And while I was there, I appointed a PR agency to help. And that PR agency was one that I was a fan of. and that was called Third Hemisphere, founded by Hannah Moreno and Jeremy Little. And at the end of my term as interim CEO, they said, "What are you going to do next?" And I said, "Nah, not really sure." So I came on board the Third Hemisphere team. So at Third Hemisphere, I work on business development, on some of the editorial and some of the marketing for the agency. I continue to do a little bit of angel investing. And then the other thing that I'm working on now is working on the beginnings of an early stage venture capital fund with the awesome Emily Rich. And that'll be a pre-seed stage focusing on teams that are building world-class products in Australia and New Zealand. So M8.ventures is where you'll find Mate Ventures.
Yep. I think that's an incredible experience, incredible years of experience that you have in the startup space and with founders. Have you found, Alan, that there are certain ingredients when you talk to new founders or maybe founders who have been running into their 5th or 6th year? Is there any commonality between people who kind of succeed more as compared to others? So are there any ingredients of being a successful founder? If anyone is listening to us today and they might be thinking, I've got a good idea in mind, but I don't know how to take it forward. Should I have some ingredients in myself to make it where I want it to be after 5 years?
Yeah, look, I wish a good idea was the primary criteria, because I'm a product guy, so I love great ideas. When I see a great idea executed in a piece of software or hardware, I get very excited. But I think one thing that the internet has taught us more than anything else is that there's no shortage of great ideas in this world. At one point, I skipped over this point of my story, but I started a music label and ran it for a few years because I knew a few people who were very, very talented musical artists, and I thought they deserved an audience, that deserved to be heard. And if I could connect them with an audience through marketing, that they could build a career as a successful musician. And the same was true in the music industry. There's no shortage of people with something to say and incredible creative talent. But there are only so many minutes in a day for the rest of us to listen and consider buying their music. So the same is true in startups. A great idea is a good thing to have, but it's certainly not the primary criteria for success. There are a lot of factors that go into whether a startup will be successful. Things like timing. You can be too early or too late to market. There are markets, there are industries, there are economic models that tend towards natural monopolies. So there are kinds of industries where one company gets ahead, builds a defensible lead on its competitors, and nobody ever catches them up again. So the listings sort of businesses, like online auctions, like employment, like real estate, like secondhand cars. Once somebody gets a lead in that market, it doesn't matter how good your idea is, doesn't matter how good your team is. It's very, very hard to get to number one spot once somebody is already in it. But then other people say, well, we've got a dream team, we've got a rock star team. Look at their caliber and the experience and the skills of the people on our team. People on the team is very important too, but it's only one factor. I think probably if I was pinned down, you tied my arms behind my back and tickled me until I told you the one thing that I thought was probably more important than anything else, I might say that it might be the ability to ask difficult questions. And the sooner you're able to ask difficult questions of people, the more likely you are to get to the truth. And success in startups comes through bringing truth to life. So sometimes you're asking difficult questions of people that you're working with because you're not quite sure why they're not contributing the way that you thought that you had agreed with them to work. The sooner you're able to have that difficult conversation with that person and course correct and get back on track, the better. If you're a startup that's advised by mentors or coaches or angels investors, the sooner those people are able to ask you difficult questions about what's going on in your business that might be embarrassing or confronting or lead to dispute. The sooner that they can do that with you, the more likely you are to course correct and get back on track towards the truth and succeed. And on the other side, the sooner you're able to say to an angel investor, look, tell me whether you're in or you're out, because we've had 6 coffee meetings now, and I don't feel like we're making any further progress. You just string me along because you find it difficult to say no to people face to face. So a lot of things in startups, not everything, but a lot of things in startup is learning how to ask people uncomfortable questions really soon to get to the truth. And the funny thing about that for me is that that's where I began, right? So a journalist is trained at the beginning to ask difficult questions of people. The question that Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg is expecting in the press conference is probably not the question that's going to lead to the truth. It's probably not going to lead to the best story for my readers. So journalists are trained from the beginning to follow the line of questioning that gets to the truth, and then that truth is what we capture and try and put on the page. And I think that's a very important skill in startups too.
Yep, and I think that's very much aligned with what one of our other speakers recently, who joined us from Portugal, his name is Mike Dias. He's the founder of Scale Up Valley, and he's guiding a lot of CEOs. And when I asked him the same question, he said one of the 2 biggest faults that startups can do is not having the right timing and not having the right intent or the metrics to track. So they don't have a bold vision on what they are doing, why they are doing, and how they are wanting to achieve it in the next 5 years. And that's something which he shared. George, do you have any questions or comments here?
Yeah, I think your version is asking the hard questions, which I 100% agree with. I call that, if you don't know what you've got and you don't know who you're selling to, you have no right to succeed. And if you can't qualify, you could be talking to the wrong person at the wrong time for the wrong reason, for the wrong price. So, and I teach that to salespeople and business people making decisions. So I would 100% support Alan in what he just said. I think the failing of a lot of inventors and founders is that they are a little bit like mothers, especially if they've created the thing. Because what happens with mothers is this ear amplifies everything that's good about their child 10 times over, and this ear is absolutely deaf to any criticism. And inventors are very much the same, and founders can quite often get into this, oh, no, Alan said that, but he doesn't understand, or Alan said it might succeed, possibly. That means he's in, and it's fantastic. And so being able to ask and also being able to answer the tough questions is very important for you to get off on the right foot. And Saurabh, one of my sayings is, have your arguments today, get on with your life tomorrow. Answer the tough questions today, ask the tough questions today, and then you find out, should I be investing in this, whether you're the founder or the investor? But it's, I quite like the fact that you take that approach. Alan, are you just focused on digital technology, that area, or do you look at other angel investment opportunities yourself?
Definitely, I'm primarily interested in tech startups. So not always software, not always digital, sometimes hardware as well, across lots of different industries and areas of the economy. But for me, technology allows us to be much more innovative and disruptive and service a much bigger target market than we can without tech. So yeah, it's kind of been my origin, and in the same way that somebody betting on horse racing probably likes to think they know a thing or two about how to judge a good horse from a bad one. I guess I feel like all my decades in tech helped me a little in choosing the best tech investments to make as well.
So within Aussie Angels, is that all about just tech, or are there different angels within Aussie Angels that look at different aspects of startups and inventions, things like that?
Honestly, I couldn't say for sure. I am a member of Aussie Angels. Aussie Angels is a SaaS platform, a software as a service platform for setting up and managing angel investor syndicates. And so it's a few years old. The founder and CEO, Cheryl Mack, is a good friend, and she and her business partners have done a fantastic job of bringing this product to market. So there are similar platforms elsewhere in the web that service the US and the UK market, but Aussie Angels was kind of first out the door to service angel investors in Australia. And the thing which is really interesting about how the platform works is that angel investment syndicates work well when angel investors are well organized into making decisions relatively quickly. So if you've got to go around 30 angel investors manually, one by one, do a pitch to them, get them to decide whether they're in or out investing in this round, a company can fall over before it raises the capital that it needs to continue. So a SaaS platform has a lot of benefits there. You can reach all of your investors at once. You can bring a founder on to give a presentation to the whole group. You can show everybody where they are in the due diligence process. You can give them access to all of the documents from the deal room. And the person managing the syndicate can see at any time who's in, who's out, and who's yet to respond. So the Aussie Angels platform is a great one. I'm honestly not too sure. I'm a member of a couple of syndicates on the Aussie Angels platform, and I'm invested in Aussie Angels as well. But I'm not too sure yet if they have other syndicates that are looking outside of tech.
Yeah. And if I may, Saurabh, one more, and then I'll let you have a go again. So a lot of people see the Lion's Den and these various shows on television where these people come in and they pitch to the 5 multi-gazillionaire people and they want 55% of the company for a $50,000 investment and all this sort of thing. Quite often they're told that their company is worth nothing because they haven't got any sales and all of that. And yet we quite often get .com and .this and .that people invest millions of dollars into for a very small percentage. What's the difference between an angel investor and the Shark Tank and the Lion's Den, in your opinion?
Yeah, so angel investor is just a label, and it applies, I think, to anybody who's primarily investing their own money. So angel investment is about taking money you've inherited or you've gotten from another business or that you've gradually saved up over time by banking some of your salary, or proceeds from a previous successful investment that you've put towards angel investing. So everybody who's investing other people's money isn't an angel investor. They could be a fund manager. They could call themselves a VC. They could be in private equity. There's lots of different labels for those sorts of people. But angel investors can be investing from a pool of $1 billion or investing from a pool of $10,000. It's not really about the check size. It's about where the source of funds. And then once you're off and away and investing, if most of the investors in your investment round are angel investors, then often we would call that an angel round. And then venture capital used to start, the first round of venture capital investment in the company used to be called the Series A, which meant the first time that this venture fund and other venture fund managers potentially had invested in this company, called that the Series A. And then there was a time about 15, 20 years ago when that wasn't early enough in a company's journey. And so VC said, okay, let's call anything that's before the Series A when things get really serious. Let's call that this. And so for a while, the first round of investment from professional investors would be called the seed. And then there would be a Series A and there would be a Series B. But now we have pre-seed as well. So there might be a pre-seed and a seed and then a Series A. So we might wrap up the pre-seed and the seed as potentially they might both be angel rounds if most of the investors or most of the capital is provided by angels. But these days a VC fund might be writing the biggest check into an investment round, even at the pre-seed stage. And so in that case, we probably wouldn't call that an angel round investment. We'd probably call that the pre-seed led by this VC fund. Have I made that more complicated or less? I'm not sure.
That's fine. That's fine.
I think that's wonderful, Alan, that you were able to touch upon the what, why, and how of angel investors in that point and in the previous points as well. Now, I just want to go back one step behind here on what you talked before. So you have already worked at Fishburners as an interim CEO last year, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So how was your experience working at Fishburners? Because Fishburners is kind of, because I worked at Fishburners for around 2-3 years, and it's definitely a very vibrant place of growing founders and startup CEOs. How did you find working in that place, and how do you see the role of places like Fishburners in the next few years to kind of further grow those Australian startups?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Sorry, well, Fishburners has a very important place in my heart because so many of the startup adventures I've had over the past 25 odd years have involved Fishburners in some capacity. So I've been there renting a desk, or I've been there working with a team before any of us are actually working full time on a startup idea. I've been there for events. I've been there as an investor, as a mentor, as a pitch coach. So to be given the opportunity to step in for an interim period and help the organization come out of COVID lockdown and recovery mode was a great honor, and I look back on it with great fondness. But I don't think I'm by any means unique. In the tech startup industry across Australia, but even more so in New South Wales, and even more so again in Sydney, the tech startup community, I would guess, maybe 60, 70, 80% of people working in tech in Sydney particularly have been at Fishburners before, probably multiple times. So the Fishburners Friday night pitch night with pizza and beer and wine these days, non-alcoholic versions of those things as well. It's just kind of it's a fixture. It's like a Saturday night football game for our industry. It's something that everybody tries to get along to, not necessarily because you're particularly interested in the startups pitching, but just because that's where it's so easy to network with people you haven't met before, and to catch up with people who you do know well and haven't seen for a while. The other important part about what Fishburners tries to do is it's always try to be the most accessible form of flexible workspace for early stage tech startups. So there are all different kinds of startups. Not all of them are tech, but in tech in particular, we have a need for perhaps more fluidity, because perhaps more than most professions, most of us can work from pretty much anywhere. We can open up a laptop or a tablet, right? And so we do need to work from a space when we want to collaborate. That might be with other industry peers, or it could be with members of our own team. But we need to work in a space where we need to collaborate. The rest of the time, perhaps we want to save our money and work from home or work from a coffee shop. And so a lot of startups that aren't tech startups are more likely to go, well, we need an office. We need a space. We need to work together. It's going to need to be flexible because our team's going to grow or shrink over time. So let's use a co-working space. But what Fishburners really specializes in is being as cheap as viably possible, and being as vibrant as viably possible, but also being as flexible as possible, so we can cater to the changing needs of a startup over weeks or months or years. So the proof of that is that there are startups that work out of Fishburners in Sydney that have been working out of Fishburners in Sydney for 8, 9, 10 years now, as their needs change. And there are other startups that have moved out of Fishburners as they feel they've outgrown it, and then have returned. So some of our alumni, some of our family have come back to work from Fishburners because of their changing circumstances. And I just think that that's a tremendous opportunity. Anytime you get to be part of the growth of a promising tech company, you should take it. And Fishburners has been the home for so many of us. It's a wonderful organization to be part of for a little while.
Yep, and I think that's what one of the biggest things there is, that it's not only a very vibrant place, but it also brings together CEOs and their teams in the same room, at a very affordable cost, which otherwise, if they have their own offices, it will cost them way more than what they can afford at a time when they don't have any cash flows or something like that. One of the other questions from my side for you would be, how do you see the future of tech startups? I think it's aligned with how fast the startup world is growing, especially within the tech community. So how do you see that moving in terms of the competition and in terms of the different kind of different range of products that we are now coming up with in different technologies? So there is not one kind of technology. There is edtech, there is health tech, there is different kind of technologies that we are using in different industries. Do you think that there are some technologies which are growing faster than the others? And do you see that that also impacts the way humans are working now? Because you can't work in
so
the way.
let me stop you there. That's a lot of questions. I don't know if we have enough time to go through all of that. But let's start maybe with the tech startup industry that we have now, and what might have, what might be different about the tech startup industry we have in Australia right now compared to where it was a few years ago. So it's an industry of change. It's probably the world's most rapidly changing industry. But you can look back on epochs, on eras of the Australian tech startup industry, and I don't think anybody has a name. I might go away and come back with a name for the era of the Australian tech startup industry that we're in right now. But here are some of the dimensions that make it different to the past. So I think one of those really important dimensions is that somehow our industry survived lockdown when we are such an in-person connection sort of industry in the past. But how we survived lockdown and how many other industries survived lockdown was by learning how to work as part of a team remotely over video like this, right? And that has massive ramifications for how we perform as an industry. And we're only just starting to see the longer term, the bigger ramifications of that shakeout. So, what's been happening for the last year or two is we've all been learning how to do this, comfortably and fluidly and relatively well. But what's going to happen from here on out is that the tech startup industry in Australia is still relatively concentrated in a couple of places. The data shows pretty clearly that the Sydney tech startup industry is the biggest. The community here is the biggest, and that it's largely clustered around Sydney Harbour, with a little bit more on the southern side of Sydney Harbour. Roundabout from Wynyard out to sort of UTS, Sydney University. And with a little bit on the lower North Shore and a little bit out west. But there's that sort of geographic focus in Sydney, and there's likewise a geographic focus in Melbourne, where the tech startup community is a little bit smaller. But we've seen already with employees of the larger tech startups, because it's easier to track their behavior with a large number of employees, that during lockdown, a lot of those employees were free to go and move to a lower cost, high quality of living part of the state that they lived in. And I forget the numbers, but there's a meaningful percentage, maybe a third, I forget, maybe close to 50% of Atlassian's employees, for instance, which no longer work within 2 hours of Atlassian's office. So they're not commuting anymore, right? So what happens when somebody is no longer commuting, but is still connected to the tech startup community, is a potentially they can pull people out to where they've moved to. So I think we're already starting the beginnings of that migration. So there's a first wave of tech migration from the empty lockdown cities of New South Wales and Victoria. And those people, are now in Wollongong, they're in Orange, they're in Bathurst, they're in Bendigo, they're in Ballarat, and they are starting to pull other people out from the cities out to where they are. When you've got sufficient critical mass in those little local regional hubs, you'll start to see startups form from those people in those places, because most people's startup ideas, even the successful ones, might run for 5 to 10 years, but most startup ideas, run something less than 3 years, something less than 18 months, right? So you go to the regions, you're working in a job, you're working on a startup idea, and it's time to change. First thing you're going to do is you're going to go around to the people that you know in Bendigo who are also part of the startup community and say, I've got this idea, or you've got this idea, I want to join your team. So that will change the character of the Australian tech startup industry, because it'll become more regionalised, it'll become less focused on Sydney and Melbourne. I think that's a very, very healthy thing, because as I've been saying for a long, long time, Australia is a highly urbanized city, and a lot of our problems as an economy and as a society, as cities with a quality of life, is the degree of that urbanization. So as we learn to get more distributed, Australia doesn't have a Boulder, Colorado, Australia doesn't have a Michigan, Australia doesn't even have a Chicago. And so, one thing that we've always suffered from is this high concentration. It will be better for our economy, better for our society when more of our tech startup industry is relocated to the regions. That's starting to happen now, but in 5 years' time, you'll look back and you'll be amazed that anybody thought that they had to be based in Surrey Hills to work on their tech startup. Another thing which has come from that lockdown experience is that the by far larger tech industry in Silicon Valley is now much more open to what's going on in Australia and New Zealand than they were 5 years ago, and certainly vastly more than they were 10 years ago. There was a time, so I was one of the founding mentors and investors in StartMate, and our, starting hypothesis, one of our primary goals in setting up StartMate was to bring Australia's best early stage tech startups to Silicon Valley. That was our actual stated aim. That's what we tried really hard to do. We took teams over there for 2 weeks, and we spent money to accommodate them and fly them over there. Spent that whole 2 weeks there, helping them learn what they were going to need to do in order to move their business there, because we knew at that time that was going to be necessary if you were going to raise venture capital and succeed. So what's happened during lockdown is that American investors, due to low interest rate economy, they've been pumped up. They've had plenty of capital to invest, looking for places to invest it. Deal flow in the US has not been sufficient to sustain them, and companies from overseas have stopped relocating to Silicon Valley due to the pandemic. So they've started to get more flexible, more open to the idea of the potential of investing in a company that you might only really get to know over a video call. So that unlocks tremendous potential for Australian startups. I think we should start to see over time and more of an evening out, less of a difference between the average valuations of companies with similar sorts of performance metrics. At the moment, US companies typically have a much higher valuation with a similar set of performance metrics to an Australian company. I think as US funds start investing in more Australian companies, that'll probably bring Australian valuations up a bit. I think deals should get done sooner, more quickly, because there will be more capital at play looking to invest in the Australian market, and more fund managers competing, more angel investors competing for the deals that are available on the market. With competition comes performance, right? So when we're tasked with competing for what we want to achieve, we work harder to get it. And so I think Australian angel investors and venture capitalists will get better at their jobs. They'll perform much better. They'll make decisions much more quickly based on better data rather than gut instinct. So I think that will, in turn, result in more successful Australian tech ventures. So, if the VCs are working harder and better, and if the angel investors are working harder and better, that ought to create better tech companies coming out of those investments. And so I think I see this as a very positive flywheel. Another really, really important thing, one more really important thing about this era of the Australian tech startup ecosystem is that we're starting to see that first generation of true Australian tech startups lose its first generation of founding employees as they get to the end of their period with the company. So employees of Atlassian, employees of Safety Culture, Culture Amp, Canva, lots of those post-Series B stage startups are starting to lose those people who were part of the first 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 people in the company. As they fully vest their employee stock options, they're suddenly in a position where they can afford to buy a first home perhaps, or start a family, or take some time out to work on a startup idea of their own. And that's another positive effect in the flywheel of the growth of the Australian tech startup ecosystem. We just didn't have those people 20 years ago. There were like 30 of us 10 years ago. Now I think there are a few hundred out there in the Australian tech ecosystem. Each one of those players, as they leave the organization that created them, they'll bring capital, they'll bring ideas, they'll bring experience and network, and create a whole new generation of awesome Aussie tech.
Thank you so much, Alan, for sharing those insights. I think that's pretty critical, because anyone who listens to this episode, they might be thinking about how does the future look like in this particular space. So those insights, I think, from your experience are pretty useful for those people. And I definitely feel that organizations like StartMate, Airtree, Investable, and these small little hubs like Fish Burners, Stone and Chalks are definitely playing a critical role in bringing the startup founders together. Because you know, as a founder, there can be times when you are losing or when you're not doing well. You need the support of other founders who can motivate you, who can boost you up and take you up during those times as well. Uh,
Absolutely.
do you have any final questions from your side, George?
Yeah, I just want to touch on the point that you were just making then, Alan, about we're losing that first wave of people and all of that. And quite often people sort of go, oh, you know, I started this, or we and the team started it, and now things have changed and all that sort of thing, or we're losing a lot of people. We were talking to somebody the other day, and I was saying that quite often who you need to start it is different to who you need to grow it, is different to who you need to take it to that next level. So do you see this changing of the guard, if I put it that way, in the Australian overall as a good thing? Because now we're going to have a lot of people with a lot of experience in a startup with a lot more education and hopefully money to be able to go to the next level and be able to further grow our businesses in Australia.
Yeah, I do. And then, you know, I talked before about my experience at Microsoft and then at Yahoo, and you were describing me there, right? So I'm an early stage guy. I'm happiest with a whiteboard, which is mostly empty, on which I can experiment with my own, you know, ideas for solving problems and challenges that an organization has. Once an organization pivots into, you know, a more mature organization where the whiteboard is much more filled in, and now the organization is making decisions based on very detailed spreadsheets and very impressive PowerPoint presentations, that's not really my jam. That's not really what I like to do. So, you know, I'm a scout. I'm a, you know, early kind of stage guy, and then later on you want to bring in nurturers and managers and you know, people who grow an organization horizontally rather than vertically. So I think, you know, that's a natural thing. It's sometimes confronting and difficult and painful and emotional experience for both the organization and for those early stage people when it's time for them to leave. So, you know, I really feel like Yahoo outgrew me before I realized that I had outgrown Yahoo, you know, and so I spent way too long struggling with how I should be contributing and whether what I was contributing still had the same sort of value to the organization before I realized it was time for me to go. And Yahoo, God bless them, were happy to have me stay on even then. So it's a very difficult experience for the organization because you're having someone leave you that has a really strong reputation in the company that people, you know, look up to as a leader or somebody that helps them understand how they should be contributing to the company, and then suddenly they up and leave. You know, obviously it's not suddenly for the person who's leaving, but it can feel suddenly for everybody else in the organization. So it's a difficult process for you when you suddenly realize that an organization has outgrown you. It's very, very difficult for the organization too, though, because they lose that person they look to for leadership. So oftentimes you'll see people need to take some time out, and sometimes it can be so traumatic that people might entirely change careers. You know, so I have ex-colleagues and now close friends who are authors and you know, media professionals and consultants of all kinds. I know somebody that does fireworks for a living, and somebody else who's a chef, because they just couldn't, you know, they didn't feel like another startup would ever really measure up to that first startup experience that they had. You know, their heart was broken, and they never want to risk having their heart broken again. Me, I've got a big heart. It's been broken many, many times. But for me, I love falling in love again and again, much more than the fear of having my heart broken.
Thank you so much for today's time. And I think this episode is definitely going to add a lot of addition to the VCs and the angel investors, but also the new founders who are listening to this episode. So thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Saurabh. It was a real pleasure to be on the show, and I do hope that you'll invite me back sometime.
Perfect.
I certainly enjoyed our conversation. Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you.
This is an Ultimate Global Podcast. Hello, and welcome to our special weekly podcast on trending international and social affairs. You're listening to Saurabh Kora and George Mavros from Sydney.